some time I've been interested in organizations that help persecuted Christians. And during the Cold War, I was very interested in Richard Wurmbrand's organization, Voice of the Martyrs, and in Brother Andrew's Open Doors. Now in the post-World Cold War era, I'm interested very much in Barnabas Fund, which assists Christians being persecuted in Islamic countries. We have one lie in the media after another. Amazing. The Israeli shooter, Muslim terrorists, and they're up in arms. They're calling it murder virtually. There's an Ora Gearing, the BBC, Channel 4, the Washington Post, the independent newspaper, where there's nothing independent about it, and the Guardian, CNN, one worse than the other. Others are more balanced, more fair. The Telegraph and Fox News in the States and Sky are more balanced, more fair. They never talk to Palestinian Christians who are pro-Israel. They never talk to Joseph Farah. Or they never speak to Asi Sharush. They never talk to Arab evangelicals who are pro-Israel. They're always against Israel. Always. The bias is unbelievable. They ignore 2.1 million dead Christians in Sudan murdered by the Muslims. They ignore the 200,000 dead Christians in East Timor murdered by the Muslims. They ignore the 55,000 dead Christians in the southern Philippines murdered by the Muslims. Just ignore it. But of course, if the Israelis shoot a Muslim terrorist, then they're up in arms. Christians are being persecuted all over the world, certainly in China. But of course, trade with China takes precedence over human rights with China. We ignore it. We're told that moderate Muslim states are our friends, that Egypt is a westernized Muslim country. If you've been on our website for the last 2 weeks, we've been getting people to write letters to the Egyptian foreign minister. The Egyptian army attacked a Christian compound 30 miles outside of Cairo. The army attacked it. They arrested 22 Christians who converted from Islam on trumped-up charges. We got the last of the, not just us, but all the people who've been writing, we got the last of them out of prison last week, out of jail last week. This is Egyptian police. These are moderate Muslim countries. There's no such thing as a moderate Muslim country. By definition, a Muslim country cannot be moderate. These are pro-Western. No, they may have governments that have self-vested interest in cooperating with the West, but they're not moderate countries. Malaysia is not a moderate Muslim country. It puts people in jail for becoming Christians. It has an apartheid government. Christians are being persecuted all over. All over. Amazing how homosexuals will scream for the right to be able to teach our children that it's normal to be a pervert. It's amazing how people will be fighting for the right to hunt foxes. Not that I disagree with them. Those things keep ripping open the dustbins on my driveway. All this country's overrun with these things. They spread disease, and if you want to hunt them, do it with my blessing. That's only my opinion. People will fight for the rights. Muslims will be in the streets demanding the murder of a British citizen for writing a book, demanding the right to kill somebody for writing a book. They'll riot in Bradford. But saved Christians will stand by and say nothing and do nothing about the persecution of Christians in Muslim countries. In fact, you've got Christians in this country who we talk about it in a newsletter, like Stephen Sizer, who would rather attack Israel, which protects the rights of Christians. What about those who are in prison? Jesus said, I was in prison and you visited me. Peter writes about those being persecuted. It's the main theme of his epistle. We have the tapes preparing for persecution. Paul certainly writes about it, and Paul certainly spent enough of his own time in prison. It's a major thing in the Bible, people being persecuted for their faith. It was a cornerstone of the teaching of Jesus. But it's not popular. Again, as I've often pointed out, the freedom we have in the Protestant democracies is a historical anomaly. It has only come about as a result of the influences of the Bible and our models of government and so forth. Now that we turn from the Word of God, democracy is disappearing quickly. And of course, that evangelist, Harry Hammond, died after being arrested when he was attacked by a gang of homosexuals and homosexual sympathizers, and the police arrested him. Now posthumously, a newspaper is taking his case to the European Court of Justice. Arresting street preachers. They won't arrest people for preaching homosexuality on the street, only for people who preach against it. This is how sick and depraved it's become. There's a battle in the media, there's a battle in the schools, there's a battle in the government. The rights of those who are being persecuted for the name of Christ. The Bible teaches plainly about something called appealing to Caesar. On our website, you can go on any day and click on appealing to Caesar. You can see the petitions. Please write the White House. Please write number 10. Please write your member of parliament or MEP or your congressman or senator in the States. Email the White House. It's called Appealing to Caesar and it's on our website. Moriel.org. We feel this is important because it's what the Bible teaches. It's what the New Testament teaches. Appealing to Caesar and helping those who are in prison for their faith. Let's look at Acts chapter 12. Now about that time, Herod the king laid his hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. All of the Herods, the whole house of Herod, its members typify the Antichrist. Herod the Great, remember? He tried to kill Jesus, coming out of Mary, so he could stay king, and then he killed all the male babies. And so in Revelation 12, we see the beast in front of the woman trying to kill the man-child, and then he makes war against her and the rest of her offspring. This is a descendant of Herod, direct descendant. The one whom Jesus appeared before, son of Herod. Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. Now the house of Herod were actually Nabatean descent. Nabateans were Moabites who converted to Judaism. Culturally, Herod was more Roman than he was Jewish. The Jewish collaborators with the Herodians and Romans were called the Herodians. The Jewish collaborators were called Herodians. They were a political cum religious sect called the Herodians. In order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread, Passover. You have this trend in the book of Acts that we talk about on the future history of the church, where what happened to Jesus happens to the apostles. And foreshadows what will happen to the church in the last days, being brought before governors and kings and the rest of it. It goes back to Matthew 10. You can get the tape, The Future History of the Church, where we explain it. But he's constructing a parody here. Jesus, the apostle. Jesus was killed at Passover under Herod. So James was killed at Passover under Herod. Ditto. Jesus was arrested at Pesach, Passover, under Herod. Peter, ditto. Peter gets arrested. Again, it's trying to show what happened to Jesus, what happened to the apostles. Now, the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD took place at Passover. It began. The early Jewish Christians, the Messianic Jews, saw it as a judgment for the martyrdom of James. The siege began the very day, according to Eusebius, that the martyrdom of James took place during Hag Matzot, Feast of Unleavened Bread. And they saw this as a judgment. Now when he had seized him, he put him in prison. Verse 3. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. Again, please the Jews meant the Judeans. It didn't mean people who were Jewish. It meant the religious establishment, the Sanhedrin, and the people who lived in and around Jerusalem who they controlled. Okay? And when he seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. Soldiers were, of course, legionnaires, Romans, handed to Roman soldiers. Ditto. Again, it's trying to show a parity between the apostles and Christ. Then they're going to bring him out to the people. Remember at Gabbatha, at the pavement of judgment, Pilate brought Jesus out, who shall I release to you? Jesus or Barabbas? Bring out to the people, the demos. Ditto. It retells the story, the Passover story, okay? In other words, what happened to Jesus continues to happen to the church. And ultimately will climax in the last days and the whole thing will be replayed in some way. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church of God. We'll come back to that. And on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. As the tomb of Jesus was guarded, ditto. They didn't want his apostles to steal his body. So they put him in there. And an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared. Now with the resurrection of Jesus, what happened? Angel rolls away the stone. Angel, as it were, opens. Ditto. And of course we know that this verse inspired Charles Wesley. My chains fell off, my heart set free. Okay. And a light struck the cell, and he struck Peter's side and roused him, saying, "Get up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. Again, this is obviously Charles Wesley was inspired by this particular verse to write the hymn. And the angel said, "Gird yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. Now you understand this, it's using Paschal language. When you go back to the Exodus, when they had to eat the Passover, they told to put the sandals on and be girded up and ready to go quick against the Passover imagery. It's showing a Paschal imagery. Okay? Wrap your cloak around you and follow me. And he went out and continued to follow, and he didn't know what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. Now, this is not the first time something like this happened to him, is it? It happened in Jaffa, at the house of Simon the Tanner, didn't it? When the Lord gives you a real vision, it's like Paul in 2 Corinthians. He said he didn't know if he was in the body or out of it. You know you're not asleep. You know what's happening. Paul didn't know if he was dead, but he knew he was alive. He did not know that was being done by the angel. He thought he was seeing a vision. And when they passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which was open for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from them. Gates opened supernaturally. Now again, in 70 AD, gates of the temple. It took 24 men to open them. And Josephus tells us that they opened automatically. The Sanhedrin misinterpreted this as an omen from God. In fact, it meant that the temple was now exposed and God took his hand off it, wouldn't protect it anymore. They misinterpreted the omen. The idea is this. When the Lord opens, no man closes. Now again, Charles Wesley was not far from wrong. We're all in bondage to sin, we're all chained. But again, when the Son sets you free, he opens the prison door and sets the captives free. It is a picture of salvation. Wesley was correct in what he wrote. He was right to apply it that way in a hymn, in worship. He was not wrong, it was right. It does illustrate something about salvation. And immediately the angel disappears. Now when Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel." He's come around now. He realizes, wait, this really happened. "And rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all the Jewish people were expecting." Whoa. This can't be real. This can't be real. Then it is real. When the Lord gives a vision, the vision will always end in reality. Like John on Patmos, it'll be based on reality. It'll relate to the real world in some way. And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. This is probably the same John Mark who caused the division, or whose membership in the missionary team was the cause of division between Paul and Barnabas. Nonetheless, let's look. Once he comes out, he first goes to women like Jesus. You understand? Women always see the truth first. They're more sensitive. Women can be deceived more easily than men. That's why leadership is male. But women get saved easier than men because they're more sensitive. Appeals to women first. And when this happens, there were many people gathered and praying. Just like when Jesus was in the tomb, the apostles were all together. And when he knocked at the door of the gate, now of course Jesus just walked through the wall, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, behold, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. Well, what happened in the garden? We saw the Lord, we saw the women begin freaking out. They couldn't even do anything. He said, it's him, he's alive. They thought that Peter was finished like James was. That's it. Herod's prison, Romans. Oh, that's what happened to Jesus. That's what happened to James. Now they got Peter. That's what they thought. No, that was a logical way to think. Wasn't unrealistic to think that way. It's what they did to Jesus, what they just did to James. Now they got Peter in the same joint. He's locked up in the same prison. So it goes to women first. And the women try to tell the apostles. But they said to her, you're out of your mind. Well, again, go to the end of John's Gospel. What were they telling the women? They wouldn't believe him. They wouldn't believe her. The apostles didn't believe. Well, that's what happened to Jesus. You understand what it's trying to do? It's all the Passover. But Peter continued knocking. When they opened the door, they saw him and were amazed. What happened with Jesus? Amazement. Nobody gets out of a Roman prison. Oh. If God can get somebody out of a tomb, he can get somebody out of a Roman prison. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent. Tell them to shut up. What did Jesus tell people? He says, just go tell my disciples I'll meet them in Galilee. Keep it down. Keep it down. Keep it down. Keep it down. If God's doing something, keep it down. Listen. These things are only for God's people to know. The gospel, go tell it on a mountain. His working to bring deliverance to his people. This is for us. This is in-house. This is not for the unsaved. This is... But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, report these things to James and the brethren, and he departed and went to another place, just like Jesus. After he fills them in, remember it says he explained the scriptures at the road to Emmaus? He filled them in, and then he goes to another place. He says, go tell Peter and the apostle, I'll meet them in Galilee. And then he goes. Jesus just goes. So what does Peter do? I'll meet you over there, I'll meet you in back of Cohen's Kosher Butcher. There's no meat deliveries during Passover. Nobody will see us over there. I'll meet you in back of Cohen's. Don't forget, he just walked out of a Roman prison. They're looking for him. The reason they're looking for him is there was the automatic sentence of death. If you let the prisoner go free, if the prisoner escaped from you when he was in your custody, that was a death sentence according to the regulations of the Roman legion. Something similar happened to Paul. Remember? He wanted to kill himself because it was better than what the Romans would have done to him. He says, now put your sword back in its sheath. We haven't escaped. It was a death sentence, and the Romans were rather cruel how they killed people. If you let somebody get away, to them that makes you suspect of sedition. You weren't just negligent in your duties, but you might have been a collaborator. Go tell the apostles. Then he gets away. Now when day came, there was no small disturbance. In other words, the sun had risen among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. Well, all you got to do is read the Gospels. And when day came and he rose, they actually bribed the Roman soldiers to say he was surrounded by his disciples, and they forcibly took the corpse or something like that. And when Herod had searched for him and not found him, he examined the guards in order that they be led away to execution. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. Notice what he does. Now, remember they questioned the soldiers at the resurrection of Jesus? So they do the same thing. Where does Pilate go? He's in Jerusalem, he goes back to Caesarea. Well, Herod does the same thing. But now it gets really interesting. We have one of the main types of the judgment of Antichrist in the Bible. Now we talk about this briefly on the Antichrist tapes. Now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon up in Lebanon, Phoenician coast, and with one accord they came to him, having won over Blastus. Now Blastus is a Roman name. Herod was more Roman than Jewish. And having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. And on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. Now, if you come with us to Israel, we take you to the amphitheater in Caesarea, where this happened. Our next tour is the 21st of April. You can get a brochure in the back if you'd like to come with us. We'll take you right where this happened. Now notice, they're getting food dependent on Herod. Remember, in the last days there'll be famines no one can buy or sell. The world's food supply will be controlled by the Antichrist. Of course, God can feed his people supernaturally. And of course, it points to things spiritual, the bread of life and so forth. Now, if you look on our website, we put up a thing where MasterCard is experimenting with an implantable chip. And a company in America, in Palm Beach, Florida, where my mother lives, has developed a subcutaneous implanted chip that contains credit card information. The prototype has just been made the first time, and it exists. They've already tested chips for implantation on cattle and things, but now the first time, a credit card, a microchip credit card, is subcutaneous, under the skin. You put it under somebody's finger, they were holding it. Picture on the internet last week. A company called Applied Data Solutions. And they made the first one. Now, MasterCard is experimenting with the technology. Not for implantation, but just for that particular kind of chip. But they said the chip can be implanted. They asked people in market research, would you take the chip? 72% said, 72 to 74% said no, not under any circumstances. But not one person they asked cited Revelation 13 as a reason. It just shows you how they're being set up for it. Now, 100 years ago, people would have just freaked out. You get the article on our website. And the people kept crying out, the voice of a God and not a man. Whenever you see a man proclaimed and worshipped as God other than Jesus Christ, it is a picture of Antichrist. And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. And the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied, and Barnabas, son of encouragement, Barnabas, and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. The same John Mark, who was there. Now this guy, John Mark, is an interesting character. Let's look very briefly at the split that would later come between Barnabas and Paul because of him. In verse 12, when they realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. This guy had been from a good family of believers. So what happens to Jesus at Passover is played out through what happens to the apostles, especially Peter, and there are similar lists of Jesus and Paul. Remember the whitewashed tomb? And the high priest servant smacks Jesus? You whitewashed wall, and the high priest servant smacks Paul. It's on the tape. Future history of the church. The point is, well, it's very interesting how this fulfills the prophecy of Jesus in Matthew 10. And it's very interesting that shows that what happened to him will happen to the church in the last days. And what it teaches about the end and the judgment of Antichrist. That stuff is all very important. How Herod typifies the Antichrist and how God's going to judge him when he has himself proclaimed to God. These things are very important. Only, what was it that prompted God to send an angel to get Peter out of that prison? It was a church that was desperately praying. This happened to Jesus. They killed James. Now they're going to kill Peter. They're afraid, they're hiding, and they're gathered, desperately praying. Please get him out of that prison. Well, right now, as we speak, in Saudi Arabia, while the President of the United States kneels down and licks the boots of the Saudi Arabian oil sheiks, those same oil sheiks are having people put in prison whose heads will be chopped off or who will be hung for putting faith in Jesus Christ, while their king or prince comes to a barbecue with the President of the United States. Christian, so-called. Or they will come to number 10 and parley with the Prime Minister of Great Britain. While Christians are being flogged, imprisoned, hung, some of them children, and being beheaded. We're told by the liars in the White House and the liars on number 10, these countries are friends. These men are liars. They're political prostitutes owned by the oil interests. Their God is Mammon. I pray for Mr. Bush every day, but I wouldn't trust him as far as I could spit. And if the Bible didn't say, respect your leaders, I'd spit at him. People protested him in Britain for the wrong reasons. Now, I pray for him, but I don't trust him, like him, or respect him. Don't tell me that a country that cuts off the heads of my brethren are my friends. They may be friends of Bush, but they're no friends of mine. If that's his version of Christianity, I wish he would find another name for it, because it's not what the Bible calls Christianity. As we speak, there are Christians in Saudi prisons. Last 3 weeks have been a hellish time for Christians in Egypt. Day before yesterday, we got the last one who had been arrested of the 22 out of jail day before yesterday. As we speak, there are Christians in prison in Iran. As we speak, there are Christians in prison in communist China. The churches in these countries are like the church was in Jerusalem here. Persecuted, socially ostracized, even hated, with no one to help them. But they prayed in earnest. If we do not identify with the Christians who are imprisoned for their faith, we cannot be truly identified with Christ himself. When I was in prison, you visited me. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute the church? Saul, Saul, why dost thou persecute? But we are his body and we are members one of another. Suppose your hand was stuck in a prison door. Most of you was out. But your hand was still stuck and you couldn't get free. Are you out of that prison? Yes and no. By the grace of God, those of us who live in Britain or America or Australia are the members of the body on this side. But the parts of the body on that side are no less parts of our body. If my hand or my arm or your hand or your arm or my foot or your foot were stuck inside, you can bet that the rest of us would be trying to get it out. You can bet you'd be using your brain to try to get that foot out. You can bet you'd be using your other hand to try to get that hand out. You can bet you would see what's happening. You can bet you'd be listening to hear what's happening. You can bet there'd be a sense of urgency to get it out. That sense of urgency was not only something for the early church. More Christians had been martyred for the name of Jesus Christ in the last 50 years than in all of human history. Papal Rome has murdered far more saved Christians than pagan Rome. Far more people have been killed in the last 2 to 3 generations for the name of Christ than in all the rest of history put together. Not only was this an issue for the early church, not only is it an issue for us today, it is more of an issue for us today than it was for them then. As we speak in Mexico, local officials at the behest of the Roman Catholic Church are arresting and persecuting Indians for becoming Christians. While Judases like Chuck Colson embrace the Roman Church, where it has political power and influence, is persecuting saved Christians the way they always have done through the centuries. Rome has murdered us before, and having the chance, Rome would murder us again. It is a religion of murder and pedophiles. And Chuck Colson is a Judas sent from hell to bring people into allegiance to an Antichrist religion. I say that as an ex-Catholic. Christians being persecuted by the Catholic Church or at the behest of the Catholic Church in Mexico. Go on the Open Doors website and read about it. And then go on Chuck Colson's website and read what he's saying about Rome. That man is a Judas from hell. May the judgment, if he does not repent, may the judgment of Christ fall upon him. For the sake of our brethren. That's my arm stuck in that door. That's my brother in that prison. They had a sense of urgency. Now notice, they didn't even pray with a lot of faith. They couldn't believe Peter would ever get out of there. They killed James. How is he going to get out? They didn't pray with a lot of faith. Without doubt, they had faith God could get him out. But they didn't have a lot of faith that God would get him out. Because when God did get him out, they couldn't believe it. One of my favorite verses in the Bible, that guy with the afflicted kid. O Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. My faith is weak, Lord. But I have enough faith to say, help my lack of it. God is gracious and powerful. A little faith goes a long way. He knows our weaknesses. They got him out. God hears prayer. God answers prayer. Remember, there is always a battle. The battle in the heavenlies relates to the battle on earth. In Daniel, Revelation, Zechariah, we see it. When Moses held up his hands, the armies of the Lord won. When he put his hands down, they lost. The outcome of these people in prison, in large part, will depend on us. Now we can talk about appealing to Caesar, but let's talk about Peter first before we do Paul. We'll talk about Paul another time, about appealing to Caesar. Why don't we have a prayer meeting at least once a month to pray for the persecuted church? Why don't we have a case of some Christian or some Christian somewhere being persecuted and all commit ourselves to write letters? The foreign ministers, members of parliament, if that was your hand stuck in the door, the rest of you would want to get it out. If that was you or a member of your family in that Muslim prison or that Chinese communist prison, I guarantee you would want Christians in the West to care about you and your family. In Egypt, they were taking people's children away from them. Imagine them taking your children, putting them in a Muslim orphanage, or putting them out to be adopted by Muslims. And these are what countries that they dare call friends of America and Britain? When you have a Judas like Colton in the church, it's no wonder you have a Judas like Bush in the White House. So what happens here in Acts chapter 12? You see, just as God judged Herod, God will judge the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party who killed those kids in Tiananmen Square and who persecuted the church. God will judge those men. The West is too profit-oriented to care about 8,000 people killed in Tiananmen Square on international TV. They don't care about it. They care about money. God will judge those party officials in China the way he judged Herod. God will judge the crown prince of Saudi Arabia and the Wahhab. God will judge them as he judged Herod. God's judgment will fall without mercy on these people, as it fell without mercy on Herod. But what else do we read? Verse 12. And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark. Now, why does he do that? The previous verse tells us. Because the people were expecting him to be killed. They were in anticipation of it. The same as the Sanhedrin stirred up the people to demand the death of Jesus, the Sanhedrin were now stirring up the people to demand the death of Peter and James. They already got James, now they want to demand the death of Peter. So where does he go for help? Well, he goes for help to other believers. These people in Mexico, in China, these people suffering under Catholicism, suffering under Islam, suffering under communism, they're coming to us for help. The problem is, there's one thing missing. When Peter came to them for help, in verse 12, many were gathered together and were praying. Unless we are gathered together and pray, why should they come to us for help? There's nobody to come for help to. But when we do gather and we do pray, prison doors open. That's what happened then. That's what happened now. Once again, if the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. God bless.